Adams, all but overwhelmed by grief, went home to Quincy. He joined his father's church for the first time, and he resolved to keep Peacefield, the family estate, much to the dismay of his wife. Louisa and John Quincy argued over money. He should remember the dismal example of Jefferson, she told him, dying in poverty while his neighbors passed the hat. That year, voters in the off-year elections decisively turned against his administration. The opposition reclaimed both houses of Congress. The Adams presidency degenerated into a train wreck of embarrassments. The man above party was a man without a party. He was overwhelmingly defeated for a second term after a scandalous campaign, probably the nastiest in American history. Remember, Andrew Jackson famously had married a woman named Rachel, who had divorced her first husband, married Jackson, only to discover the paperwork had never been completed. And in the 1828 campaign, Adams supporters brought this to light. The president himself was uninvolved, but it was a very ugly campaign on both sides. Adams was criticized by the Jacksonians for defiling the White House by purchasing a billiard table with public funds, by traveling on the Sabbath and therefore profaning religion. He was even accused while minister to Russia of having been a pimp for the Tsar. In any event, Jackson won overwhelmingly. Adams wrote, "The sun of my political life sets in the deepest gloom." Then within weeks, history repeated itself yet again. Within weeks of leaving the White House, his alcoholic son, George Washington Adams. Can you imagine the burden of being named George Washington Adams in that household? George Washington Adams leapt to his death from a steamboat off Long Island. For years, the old man nagged and bullied his three sons, driving them on to meet his perfectionist standards. 1 hour of the morning lamp is better than 3 of the evening taper, he reminded anyone who would listen, adding for emphasis, genius is the child of toil. To which his son Charles pointed out that after rising at 5, a vigorous round of exercise, and 12 hours of business, it was not uncommon for his father to fall asleep at the dinner table. John Quincy went on dispensing advice. He could not break the habits of a lifetime, overriding family protest, above all from Louisa. They had knockdown, drag-out fights. In 1831, John Quincy could not resist the magnetic pull of politics. He ran for the House of Representatives. He's the only time in American history that a former president of the United States would deign to enter the lower house of Congress. For the next 17 years, he represented his Massachusetts district, personifying the Unionist cause on the floor of the House of Representatives, denouncing slavery, and insisting on the right of every American citizen to petition his government. It is hard to believe, but it is an indication of how intense emotions were in those years before the Civil War, that the very act of sending a petition to Congress protesting slavery, calling for its abolition, was outlawed by Congress. I mean, blatantly unconstitutional. One lonely voice stood up, refusing to be gagged, and that was, of course, John Quincy Adams. He would not be silenced. Year after year, he protested the gag rule as an infringement on basic liberty. Southerners called him the madman from Massachusetts. Admirers called him old man eloquent. 77 years old, when the rule was at last repealed, he remained as harshly self-critical as ever. A few days before his death, he wrote in his diary, "I should have been one of the greatest benefactors of my country, but the conceptive power of mind was conferred upon me by my Maker, and I have not improved the scanty portion of his gifts as I might and ought to have done." The words are the words of John Quincy, but the voice is the voice of Abigail. On February 12, 1848, he collapsed at his desk on the floor of the House. From there, he was carried to the Speaker's office where he died 2 days later. Now, legend is that his last words were, "This is the last of earth, I am content." But I don't believe it for a moment, because John Quincy Adams was never content. And I cannot imagine that that's how he would wish to go out. It was left to an old Jacksonian, Thomas Hart Benton, to deliver the most suitable benediction on Adams, the political heir of George Washington. This is a parallel. George W. Bush is not his father's son politically. He's Ronald Reagan's son politically. John Quincy Adams was not his father's son politically. He was George Washington's son, whose lonely defiance of popular opinion would one day earn him a chapter in Profiles in Courage, the work of another Massachusetts congressman and president named John F. Kennedy. This is what Benton said: "Where could death have found him but at the post of duty?" It was an epitaph even an Adams could appreciate. Thank you very much. And I know we've got some mics here, so we've got a few minutes, and if you've got questions, comments, observations, anything, sing out. Oh, come on. Yeah.
I have a question about the Kentucky and Virginia resolves. Were they ever passed? Were they enacted in law?
Yeah. The state legislatures enacted them.
Okay.
So what they were basically a shot across the bow. And but that's pretty serious, particularly in this supercharged atmosphere of the time. And as I say, they would be referred to later on by people like Calhoun and others.
But if they were law, why not?
There was no way of enforcing them.
Okay.
And events superseded them. The fact that Adams didn't go to war with France, that he in effect sort of pricked the balloon before it got out of control. So gradually emotions, and of course, within a year, Jefferson was being elected president. So there was no longer, what Jefferson called the Revolution of 1800 was in no small measure inspired by those resolutions. Yeah.
Just wondering why you made that statement, just verify a little bit, that the president right now is more like with Reagan than he was with his father. I didn't just get the connections, just kind of
Right.
wanted to.
Let me distinguish between how he sees himself and how maybe others may see him. But that's an important distinction. But there's no doubt that when George W. Bush came to Washington, he saw himself very much as someone who wanted to carry out Ronald Reagan's agenda. More than that, he saw himself as someone who didn't want to repeat what he saw as the mistakes of his father. What were they? Ironically, they are what many historians credit his father with recalling his read my lips, no new taxes pledge. There was a sense that the first Bush presidency foundered on the fact that they retracted that pledge. I think you can make a case that it was a statesmanlike and courageous decision, unpopular at the time, but in retrospect, probably the genesis of the enormous economic boom that took place throughout the 90s. But there's no doubt that the first Bush presidency was haunted by concern about the right wing of the Republican Party, keeping them close, and that is something, that cautionary lesson, if you will, is something that came back and arguably defined the second Bush presidency.